Content note. The romance of a rogue contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and the romanticization of stalking. Listen at your own risk. Content note for Chapter 3 of The Romance of a Rogue. This chapter does contain some period-typical depictions of race. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 3. When Bruce Lowry woke from the sleep of utter exhaustion into which he had at last fallen, he lay for some moments on his back, staring before him with blank eyes. Instead of the bare prison walls and cold grayness of everything to which he had grown accustomed, bright sunshine was streaming in at the open window, and outside in the street was the rumble of passing traffic. There were pictures on the wall opposite, and the crackle of a wood fire filled the room. For an instant longer he lay fighting the dreamlike sense of unreality that held him bound. Then he started up. "Why didn't you wake me? What time is it? Why on earth didn't you wake me?" John Christopher sat by the fire, making toast with grave precision. He was in his shirt sleeves and carpet slippers, and looked even bluer about the chin than he had done overnight, and a long, lank lock of hair hung dejectedly over his forehead. He smiled when Lowry spoke, and waved a deprecating hand. "No need to apologize. No need at all," he said in his deep voice. "The day is yet young, only 10 o'clock, and we artistes are privileged to sleep an hour or so longer. Nature demands it of us. She knows the candle cannot be burnt at both ends. Breakfast is ready when you are, and in the meantime, pray make use of my sponge and brushes if you have no objection to so doing." Bruce made his toilet as best he could, and came back to the fire. There was a large pot of tea on the small round table, and 2 kippers simmered on a hot dish in the grate. "I hope you slept well and were not too uncomfortable," Christopher said courteously. He spoke with the air of a wealthy host dispensing hospitality, and Bruce Lowry answered, "I slept well when I managed to get off, but I lay awake for a long time first." "You were not comfortable, perhaps. I am sorry." Lowry laughed cynically. "It was not that. As a rule, I can sleep anywhere, but last night, well, perhaps it was a guilty conscience that kept me awake." "We have all suffered from the same discomfort," Christopher answered calmly, "but we do not all like admitting it. Pray, help yourself to fish." Both men made a good breakfast, and when it was over, the rogue said with rough emotion, "You know, you're a damned good sort." The elder man's sallow face flushed a little, and he shrugged his sloping shoulders. "I like you," he answered simply, "and what is more, I believe in you, sir. Without knowing anything of your history, I am sure that at heart you are a white man." Bruce Lowry rose abruptly and walked over to the window. He spoke with his back turned. "Your trust in me deserves my confidence in return. I should like to tell you my story." Christopher interrupted quickly. "I have not asked for it, and neither do I expect to hear it, unless the telling will be of satisfaction to you. We all have dark and secret places in our lives. Only, as I said just now, we are not all willing to admit that they exist." The rogue seemed not to hear. He went on speaking jerkily in little, disconnected sentences. "6 years ago, I was a well-to-do man. At the present moment, my brother Edward is one of the best-known and richest men in London. I had everything I wanted. I was engaged to be married, but like many of us, I was too ambitious. I was not content with having enough money. I wanted more. I wanted to be rich and influential, one of the great men of the world. It was then that I met Hardingham and his friend Biscoe. There is no harm in my mentioning their names to you, because I know you will respect this confidence. They were a most extraordinary pair, and they attracted me from the first. I can see now that Biscoe was the brains, and Hardingham the decoy, if you can use such a word. Biscoe was a South African Jew, a quiet sort of man with a cultured air and irreproachable manners that would have carried him anywhere. Hardingham was a very different type, younger, and he had a most marvelous personality. I can't describe it, but from the first he made me believe in him. Absolutely. He laughed bitterly. There was a time when I would have taken that man's word before the world. There was a time when I had a far greater affection and respect for him than I had for my own brother. They were financiers, these two, or at least that is what they called themselves. They seemed to know a great many influential people, and they said quite openly that they had come from the Cape to arrange for the completion of a scheme they had in hand, a scheme by which they could make a fortune for themselves and for half a dozen other people besides. I need not go into details. They would not interest you. They did not ask me to go in with them, did not even hint at such a thing. That is where they were so clever, I suppose, for at any rate I walked right into the trap and fell for them. They allowed the suggestion to come from me. I had a little capital, and I thought I saw a chance of doubling and trebling it. He stopped and drew a hard breath. Well, of course the whole thing was a gigantic swindle. I went into it entirely on my own judgment, asking nobody's advice. As I said, I would have sworn by Hardingham, and he let me down. I lost every farthing I had. When I realized how bad things really were, I appealed to my brother to help me. He refused, of course, laughed, and told me I should have asked his advice before I made such a fool of myself. Then I appealed to Hardingham, which proved that I was indeed the fool Edward had called me. I was to have been married in a month, and I was broke, ruined, without a shilling in the world, and no end to my liabilities. I was afraid to tell the girl I was to have married. She would not have understood how I came to be mixed with such men, and I was afraid that her father would insist on the engagement being broken. He was a poor man himself, but he was ambitious for his daughter. She was his only child, you see. I was at my wit's end. Then I found out that Hardingham and Biscoe had both feathered their own nests pretty luxuriously, and were making plans to clear out of the country, leaving me and others fools to stand the racket. That finished me, and I was desperate that last day when I left my brother's house to find them out. I don't know what I intended to do. Plead with them, perhaps, threaten them, but nothing more. On my honor. He broke off and passed a shaking hand across his eyes. Biscoe was alone in his office when I got there. It was a winter's afternoon, and he was sitting at a table writing. I can see it all as if it were yesterday. There was a lamp beside him with a green shade to it, and that green shade threw a horrid leer on his face. He smiled when he saw me. A sneering, contemptuous smile that drove me mad. I called him a thief and a crook, some such words, and he answered that it was only on the credulity of such fools as I that he and his precious partner lived. One thing led to another, and finally he ordered me out of the room. I refused to go. Then he tried to put me out. I can't remember quite what happened then, but the touch of his hands on me turned the world red. There was a heavy ruler lying on the desk, and I struck him with it. There was an eloquent silence. Beauty, lying asleep at her master's feet, stirred, stretched herself, and curled up again. Bruce Lowry went on. I sent for the police myself, and a doctor, and he died the following day. I was arrested, of course, and tried for murder. I was a young man, and he was old. That told against me. The counsel for the crown got full value out of my cowardice, I can tell you, and also of our business transactions, and my coming marriage. To cut a long story short, they brought it in as manslaughter, and I got 6 years. 6 years for unintentionally ridding the world of a vile scoundrel whose death I have never found it in my heart to regret, although I swear to you by all I hold sacred. He broke off again, struck by the solemnity of his own words. Were there still things in the world which he held sacred? After a moment, he went on. That's my story. I went to prison for 6 years. 6 eternal, damnable years. The girl I was engaged to threw me over, and that was the last straw. I got reckless and brutal. I didn't care what happened. The only thing that kept me from trying to end my life was the hope that someday when I got out, I could have my revenge on her and Hardingham. I meant to hunt him down and punish him if it took me till my dying day. I meant to find her if I had to search every quarter of the earth. And again he stopped, jaggedly. Christopher stooped and stroked Beauty's soft head. But you have not had to search so far, he said quietly. The rogue turned round from the window. His face was strained, but there was a softened, humbled look about him that gave him youth. You guessed. Then, last night. Christopher was stroking Beauty again, and he did not look up as he answered. I have knocked about the world all my life, and I know something of human nature, and my intuition is good. There was a long silence, broken only by Beauty's gentle breathing. Then the rogue said hoarsely, For 6 years I prayed to God, or the devil, to curse her for throwing me over as she did. And last night, when I saw her again, I knew that, although it seemed as if my prayer had been answered, the curse had come home to roost. For last night, I know it was I who suffered, more than she. The elder man made no attempt to answer, and after a moment Bruce Lowry went on. If you had known her as I did 6 years ago, and remembered her as she was then, you'd see the change. Now, I tell you, it was horrible, devilish. I had pictured her as happy and prosperous. I'd hated her because I thought that while I rotted in prison, she was free, enjoying life. Poor child, she does not look as if she has enjoyed her life very much, Christopher said quietly. Bruce Lowry came back to where he sat. What do you know about her? He asked urgently. Where does she live? Why has she changed to what I saw last night? Christopher shook his head. I know very little. She's only been in my orchestra for a few weeks. She calls herself Miss Lee. I do not even know if that is her right name. She's never told me where she lives, or anything about herself. That she is poor, anyone can see. That she is unhappy. You do not need me to tell you. I have tried to help her in small ways. It is not in my power to do much, but what little I have been able. And she is proud. Very proud. Bruce wandered back to the window again. My God, if I could only undo the past, he broke out with sudden passion. 6 wasted years. Christopher rose and followed him. He laid a thin hand on the younger man's shoulder. If you can admit that they are wasted years, you can be very sure that they are not, he said kindly. You are still a young man. Lowry broke in with a bitter laugh. Young. If you knew how old I feel. It is never too late to be what one might have been, Christopher said. He waited a moment, then moved away again. If you will kindly excuse me for half an hour, he said more briskly, I will take Beauty for her morning walk. Make yourself at home, and remember that somewhere the sun is always shining. He looked down at Beauty. Come, my dear, he said, and a moment later the rogue was alone. He turned from the window and sat down by the fire, his hands loosely clasped and hanging between his knees. The sense of unreality was slowly leaving him, but if he was waking, it was to the knowledge that the shock of last night was a real thing, and not a dream. That woman with the tragic face and hennaed hair was indeed Charmian. His Charmian, the girl he had adored, the girl he had held in his arms, and who should have been his wife. He had left her young, happy, and beloved, and he had found her again tired, ill, and lonely. God! Was he to blame? She had said so last night. She had said that he was responsible for what she had become. The remembrance drove him to his feet and set him pacing the narrow little room once more in unbearable agitation. He had cursed her, prayed that she might be unhappy, and his prayer had come true. The 6 years that had passed had left a heavier seal on her than it had on him. He went to the mantel shelf and looked at his face in a little glass. There was gray in his hair and lines in his face, but there was not that terrible look of hopelessness in his eyes that he had seen in hers last night. Rather, was there a new strength and resolution. He turned his back on the mirror and looked round the room. It was shabbily furnished, but neat and clean. Christopher's narrow bed stood in one corner, with a cushion beneath it for Beauty to sleep on. There was a round table in the center of the room, covered with a mended, soiled cloth. The breakfast china was all odd, and most of it cracked. One cup was handleless. There were several cheaply framed prints on the walls, obviously belonging to to the landlady, but the mantel shelf was crowded with photographs of all sizes and shapes of men and women, singers or musicians, all of them celebrities, photographs taken 20 years ago or more, fading fast, and all dated hopelessly by their clothes. With a faint feeling of curiosity, Bruce moved nearer to them. They seemed like a chapter from Christopher's past life, a chapter of pathos which yet he had not been able to bring himself to close. The whole room was depressing with its faded memories, even rather sordid, and yet Bruce Lowry realized that it was a better home than anything he could hope to afford, and his brother's curt words came back to him mockingly. "If a passage to the colonies is any good to you." He gritted his teeth. He was to be driven out of England, hounded away out of sight, branded forever as a failure and a rogue, given no chance to win his way back. He squared his shoulders and drew a hard breath. He was not down and out yet. As Christopher said, it was never too late to be what one might have been. He would let the world see that because a man had once been knocked down, it did not mean that he could never rise again. He would show them, moreover, that he was strong enough to lift another with him, Charmian, the woman he had loved, the woman whose downfall had begun with his own sin. When Christopher returned, the rogue was ready to go out. "I must look about for something to do," he explained, and there was a new energy in his voice. "At the present moment, I have rather less than £1 in the world." Christopher put down some parcels he carried. "I hope very much that you will return and make this your headquarters until such time as you are able to make better arrangements," he said. "And I am sincere when I say that." Bruce held out his hand. "You are the friend I should have hoped to find had I had any hope left in me yesterday when I came out of prison," he said. "And I shall be only too glad to stay with you for the present, if I may." He felt almost light-hearted as he went down the winding stairs. He was a man once more with an ambition, not merely a machine with a pool of hatred where his heart had been, but a man with a goal towards which he strained more fiercely than he had ever strained towards revenge, a goal that would only be reached when he succeeded in raising Charmian once more to the place from which she said he had dragged her down. That is the end of Chapter 3 of A Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day. Bye!